When you're learning jazz, then it's nice to have simple and clear rules to follow and guide you. Unfortunately, rules are rarely a good way to describe music, as you'll see in this video. So there are a lot of very common rules that you should be breaking as soon as you can, because they will only waste your practice time and keep you from learning important things. A big part of jazz vocabulary is the sound of chromatic enclosures and passing notes. And this is a rule about that. Chromatic passing notes should never be on the downbeat. So why is this not a rule? Well, the point of a chromatic leading note is to create tension that then resolves to a chord or a scale note. And it does that whether you place it on a downbeat or on an upbeat. Placing it on a downbeat will only create more tension, but that's also something that works as a sound, like this. You want to learn to use this creatively, and it is really just a part of the jazz vocabulary. It's also easy to find examples. Here's Charlie Parker's Billy's Bounce. But he also used it in this famous rhythm changes theme. So you can put leading notes wherever you want, just like Parker. The only thing you have to worry about is whether it sounds good. Let's take another very common misunderstanding with notes, but this time the notes in the scale. A lot of questionable choices have been made in the name of avoid notes. I imagine this is mostly because the name is too short, it's a bit unclear, and it's also easy to get wrong or abuse. An avoid note is a note over a chord that is dissonant. So the usual example is the 4th or 11th over a major chord. So an F over a C major 7. Listen to how the flat 9 between the E and the F really begs to resolve. Let me show you an example of how you can use avoid notes, because they're actually great for moving things along and making it a bit more interesting. And in general, I think it's way better to focus on what you want to play and not spend time worrying about not hitting certain notes when you're soloing. And the same goes for choosing scales that don't have any avoid notes, or practicing not to use them, because they're part of the entire picture. They're part of the music, and it would be boring without them. Check out how this line has some tension that really resolves. I'm playing the avoid note F on beat 1 of bar 2. But there are not only wrong rules about which notes to play, there are also rules about which techniques you're allowed to use. Once in a while, you'll hear people insist that certain techniques are not allowed in certain styles of music. So there's no tapping in blues, unless of course Billy Gibbons does it, and there's no bending in jazz. But of course, that's not really true. There's quite a lot of bending in jazz, even if there are also complete albums without any bending and many guitarists who never use that technique. Often, when it's used, it's connected to blues phrases, like this Barney Kessel example. But it's also important to mention that there are actually jazz guitarists who have made this a part of their expressive vocabulary outside of the blues sound. I think my favorite for this is probably Pat Metheny. I made a longer video on this a few years ago, and to me it was always a bit surprising that this was such a sensitive topic. It's just a technique after all, and you don't have to use all techniques all the time. Surely there's no outrage that people don't play sweep arpeggios in blues every other solo. Now, I don't think of this, or I never thought of this as a rule, and you probably won't find a lot of bend in bob lines, but that's probably because the effect of this technique really comes across better with long, sustained notes. Something that there's just not a lot of in bebop lines. But it's up to you to figure out how it fits in your playing. Now, this might offend a few people, but I always imagined that it came from guitarists who were not that familiar with jazz going to jam sessions and then getting criticized when they were playing their blues cliches over jazz pieces without really sounding like jazz or connecting to the song or the groove. My personal favorites when it comes to using bending in jazz would probably be Schofield and Metheny, who sort of take it out of the blues context a bit as well. Let's go to what I think is probably the biggest waste of time for beginning jazz guitarists. This rule will help you waste a lot of time very quickly, so feel free to ignore it. You need to practice everything in all keys and all positions. There's a good reason for eventually taking some things and then working through that in all keys and all positions on the instrument. But I think this is probably more for a few sort of very fundamental things like the 3 basic scales, major, harmonic minor, and melodic minor, diatonic arpeggios, diatonic triads, that sort of foundational vocabulary. Let me show you just how easy it is to overload yourself with work, and then afterwards I'll show you what you're probably missing then and talk about why that's important. Here is a great, very basic line consisting of an enclosure and an arpeggio. It's a simple melody, so you should check it out for all the diatonic chords in C major. But you also need it in other positions. How is it in other keys? Maybe do all 12. Yeah, actually, this probably also works in harmonic minor. Or are we now kind of getting to the point where maybe it's more useful to start working on using this in your solos? You can take the lick and then add another ending. Maybe it's nice with some more chromatic stuff and even a leading note on the downbeat. Or you can lead into it with a Coltrane pattern. You need to be realistic with what you get out of it. And I think working like this is great for exploring. It's something you can do once in a while, but it shouldn't be how you approach everything. I often see well-meaning comments saying that you need a foundation in music theory and technique to get started playing jazz. And I don't think that's true. You can actually get started with a lot less, even no theory at all. Just start by learning solos by ear and other vocabulary, and then use that to learn the theory, use that to figure out what technique you need to learn. If you're starting with some not too modern bop-inspired stuff, then most of that is probably anyway going to be major scale with a few chromatic notes and the odd blues phrase here and there. You can get very far with that. Don't get lost in modes, different minor scales and upper structures, triads just right away. You can better focus on learning to improvise, getting the right vocabulary, the right sound, and learning to play songs. That's probably closer to why you're interested in jazz in the first place. I'm sure you didn't start learning to play jazz just because you wanted to know what melodic minor was. And my jazz guitar roadmap course is also built around that concept as well. A major scale, some arpeggios, a song, and then figuring out how to play solos using rhythm, phrasing and chromatic stuff to make it sound right. It really doesn't have to be that complicated. When it comes to chords and comping, it's also important not to overcomplicate things. And I think Joe Pass has a really great down-to-earth take on this, which is quite easy to turn into a very practical approach to chords, and from there expand it into a lot of beautiful harmony. I go over that in this video. Check it out so that you can level up your comping and your chord melody playing.